Hello everybody and welcome to Relaxing Reads. Today we're going to be taking a look at George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. I'll be reading the Oxford World's Classics version. I will leave links in the description below on where to purchase this edition of the book. Today's video will be the first 3 chapters of the book. If you like this, then please tell me down below in the comments whether you want to hear more of it. So I'm going to start off this video by reading you the blurb on the back of this edition. If this was history, it did not feel like it. The Spanish Civil War was the turning point in Orwell's career. He arrived in Spain in December 1936, full of idealism and determined to defeat fascism. He barely escaped just 6 months later, a bitter man on the run from the secret police. Homage to Catalonia is Orwell's first-hand account of his time in Spain. In it, he sets out the story of the war and confronts his own naivety and the mistakes he made. The lessons Orwell learned would inform both Animal Farm and 1984. The war acted as a crucible for his views, and he would spend the rest of his career denouncing lies, propaganda, and thought control. Okay, so obviously, as this is a public domain novel, there are many versions out there. In this edition, it starts with a very detailed introduction. There's a historical background in there, some controversies, reception and legacy. Then there's a note on the text, a select bibliography, a chronology of George Orwell, and then there's a map of the division of Spain in 1936. All of that I will leave if you want to purchase this version of the book. It's very good, I recommend it. But today I'm just going to be reading the actual text. Remember, if you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe below. It really helps out. And on that note, let's get into it. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou be like unto him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 to 5. Chapter 1. In the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, the day before I joined the militia, I saw an Italian militiaman standing in front of the officers' table. He was a tough-looking youth of 25 or 6, with reddish-yellow hair and powerful shoulders. He was standing in profile to me, his chin on his breast, gazing with a puzzled frown at a map which one of the officers had open on the table. Something in his face deeply moved me. It was the face of a man who would commit murder and throw away his life for a friend. The kind of face you would expect in an anarchist, though as likely as not he was a communist. There were both candour and ferocity in it, also the pathetic reverence that illiterate people have for their supposed superiors. Obviously he could not make head or tail of the map. Obviously he regarded map reading as a stupendous intellectual feat. I hardly know why, but I have seldom seen anyone, any man, I mean, to whom I have taken such an immediate liking. While they were talking round the table, some remark brought it out that I was a foreigner. The Italian raised his head and said quickly, "Italiano?" I answered in my bad Spanish, "No, inglés. ¿Y tú?" "Italiano." As we went out, he stepped across the room and gripped my hand very hard. Queer, the affection you can feel for a stranger. It was as though his spirit and mine had momentarily succeeded in bridging the gulf of language and tradition and meeting in utter intimacy. I hoped he liked me as well as I liked him. But I also knew that to retain my first impression of him, I must not see him again, and needless to say, I never did see him again. One was always making contacts of that kind in Spain. I mention this Italian militiaman because he was stuck vividly in my memory. With his shabby uniform and fierce, pathetic face, he typifies for me the special atmosphere of that time. He is bound up with all my memories of that period of the war. The red flags in Barcelona, the gaunt trains full of shabby soldiers creeping to the front, the grey, war-stricken towns farther up the line, the muddy, ice-cold trenches in the mountains. This was in late December 1936, less than 7 months ago as I write, and yet it is a period that has already receded into enormous distance. Later events have obliterated it much more completely than they have obliterated 1935, or 1905 for that matter. I had come to Spain with some notion of writing newspaper articles, but I had joined the militia almost immediately, because at that time and in that atmosphere it seemed the only conceivable thing to do. The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia, and the revolution was still in full swing. To anyone who had been there since the beginning, it probably seemed even in December or January that the revolutionary period was ending. But when one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with the red flags, or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying that it had been collectivized. Even the bootblacks had been collectivized and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said señor or don or even usted. Everyone called everyone else comrade and thou, and said salud instead of buenos dias. Tipping was discouraged. Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from an hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. There were no private motor cars, they had all been commandeered, and all the trams and taxis and much of the other transport were painted red and black. The revolutionary posters were everywhere, flaming from the walls in clean reds and blues that made the few remaining advertisements look like daubs of mud. Down the Ramblas, the wide central artery of the town where crowds of people streamed constantly to and fro, the loudspeakers were bellowing revolutionary songs all day and far into the night, and it was the aspect of the crowds that was the queerest thing of all. In outward appearance, it was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes, or blue overalls of some variant of the militia uniform. All this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I did not understand. In some ways I did not even like it, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. Also, I believed that things were as they appeared, that this was really a workers' state, and that the entire bourgeoisie had either fled, been killed, or voluntarily come over to the workers' side. I did not realize that great numbers of well-to-do bourgeois were simply lying low and disguising themselves as proletarians for the time being. Together with all this, there was something of the evil atmosphere of war. The town had a gaunt, untidy look, roads and buildings were in poor repair, the streets at night were dimly lit for fear of air raids, the shops were mostly shabby and half empty. Meat was scarce and milk practically unobtainable. There was a shortage of coal, sugar and petrol, and a really serious shortage of bread. Even at this period, the bread queues were often hundreds of yards long, yet so far as one could judge, the people were contented and hopeful. There was no unemployment, and the price of living was still extremely low. You saw very few conspicuously destitute people, and no beggars except the gypsies. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. In the barbers' shops were anarchist notices. The barbers were mostly anarchists, solemnly explaining that barbers were no longer slaves. In the streets were coloured posters appealing to prostitutes to stop being prostitutes. To anyone from the hard-boiled, sneering civilization of the English-speaking races, there was something rather pathetic in the literalness with which these idealistic Spaniards took the hackneyed phrases of revolution. At that time, revolutionary ballads of the naivest kind, all about proletarian brotherhood and the wickedness of Mussolini, were being sold on the streets for a few centimes each. I have often seen an illiterate militiaman buy one of these ballads, laboriously spell out the words, and then, when he had got the hang of it, begin singing it to an appropriate tune. All this time I was at the Lenin barracks, ostensibly in training for the front. When I joined the militia, I had been told that I should be sent to the front the next day, but in fact I had to wait while a fresh centuria was got ready. The workers' militia, hurriedly raised by the trade unions at the beginning of the war, had not yet been organised on an ordinary army basis. The units of command were the section, of about 30 men, the centuria, of about 100 men, and the column, which in practice meant any large number of men. The Lenin barracks was a block of splendid stone buildings with a riding school and enormous cobbled courtyards. It had been a cavalry barracks and had been captured during the July fighting. My centuria slept in one of the stables, under the stone mangers where the names of the cavalry chargers were still inscribed. All the horses had been seized and sent to the front, but the whole place still smelt of horse piss and rotten oats. I was at the barracks about a week. Chiefly I remember the horsey smells, the quavering bugle calls. All our bugles were amateurs. I first learned the Spanish bugle calls by listening to them outside the fascist line. The tramp-tramp of hobnailed boots in the barrack yard, the long morning parades in the wintry sunshine, the wild games of football, 50 aside, in the gravelled riding school. There were perhaps 1,000 men at the barracks, and a score or so of women, apart from the militiamen's wives who did the cooking. There were still women serving in the militias, though not very many. In the early battles they had fought side by side with the men as a matter of course. It is a thing that seems natural in time of revolution. Ideas were changing already, however. The militiamen had to be kept out of the riding school while the women were drilling there, because they laughed at the women and put them off. A few months earlier, no one would have seen anything comic in a woman handling a gun. The whole barracks was in a state of filth and chaos to which the militia reduced every building they occupied, and which seems to be one of the byproducts of revolution. In every corner you came upon piles of smashed furniture, broken saddles, brass cavalry helmets, empty sabre scabbards, and decaying food. There was a frightful wastage of food, especially bread. From my barrack room alone, a basketful of bread was thrown away at every meal, a disgraceful thing when the civilian population was short of it. We ate at long trestle tables out of permanently greasy tin pannikins, and drank out of a dreadful thing called a porron. A porron is a sort of glass bottle with a pointed spout from which a thin jet of wine spurts out whenever you tip it up. You can thus drink from a distance without touching it with your lips, and it can be passed from hand to hand. I went on strike and demanded a drinking cup as soon as I saw a porron in use. To my eye the things were altogether too like bed bottles, especially when they were filled with white wine. By degrees they were issuing the recruits with uniforms, and because this was Spain, everything was issued piecemeal, so that it was never quite certain who had received what, and various of the things we most needed, such as belts and cartridge boxes, were not issued till the last moment, when the train was actually waiting to take us to the front. I have spoken of the militia uniform, which probably gives a wrong impression. It was not exactly a uniform. Perhaps a multiform would be the proper name for it. Everyone's clothes followed the same general plan, but they were never quite the same in any two cases. Practically everyone in the army wore corduroy knee breeches, but there the uniformity ended. Some wore puttees, others corduroy gaiters, others leather leggings or high boots. Everyone wore a zipper jacket, but some of the jackets were of leather, others of wool and of every conceivable colour. The kinds of cap were about as numerous as their wearers. It was usual to adorn the front of your cap with a party badge, and in addition nearly every man wore a red or red and black handkerchief round his throat. A militia column at that time was an extraordinary-looking rabble, but the clothes had to be issued as this or that factory rushed them out, and they were not bad clothes considering the circumstances. The shirts and socks were wretched cotton things, however, quite useless against cold. I hate to think of what the militiamen must have gone through in the earlier months before anything was organised. I remember coming upon a newspaper of only about 2 months earlier in which one of the POUM leaders, after a visit to the front, said that he would try to see to it that every militiaman had a blanket, a phrase to make you shudder if you have ever slept in a trench. On my second day at the barracks, there began what was comically called instruction. At the beginning, there were frightful scenes of chaos. The recruits were mostly boys of 16 or 17 from the back streets of Barcelona, full of revolutionary ardour but completely ignorant of the meaning of war. It was impossible even to get them to stand in line. Discipline did not exist. If a man disliked an order, he would step out of the ranks and argue fiercely with the officer. The lieutenant who instructed us was a stout, fresh-faced, pleasant young man who had previously been a regular army officer and still looked like one, with his smart carriage and spick-and-span uniform. Curiously enough, he was a sincere and ardent socialist. Even more than the men themselves, he insisted upon complete social equality between all ranks. I remember his pained surprise when an ignorant recruit addressed him as Senor. "What? Senor? Who is that calling me Senor? Are we not all comrades?" I doubt whether it made his job any easier. Meanwhile, the raw recruits were getting no military training that could be of the slightest use to them. I had been told that foreigners were not obliged to attend instruction. The Spaniards, I noticed, had a pathetic belief that all foreigners knew more of military matters than themselves, but naturally I turned out with the others. I was very anxious to learn how to use a machine gun. It was a weapon I had never had a chance to handle. To my dismay, I found that we were taught nothing about the use of weapons. The so-called instruction was simply parade ground drill of the most antiquated, stupid kind. Right turn, left turn, about turn, marching at attention in column of threes, and all the rest of that useless nonsense which I had learned when I was 15 years old. It was an extraordinary form for the training of a guerrilla army to take. Obviously, if you have only a few days in which to train a soldier, you must teach him the things he will most need: how to take cover, how to advance across open ground, how to mount guards and build a parapet, above all, how to use his weapons. Yet this mob of eager children, who were going to be thrown into the front line in a few days' time, were not even taught how to fire a rifle or pull the pin out of a bomb. At the time, I did not grasp that this was because there were no weapons to be had. In the POUM militia, the shortage of rifles was so desperate that fresh troops reaching the front always had to take their rifles from the troops they relieved in the line. In the whole of the Lenin barracks there were, I believe, no rifles except those used by the sentries. After a few days, though still a complete rabble by any ordinary standard, we were considered fit to be seen in public, and in the mornings we were marched out to the public gardens on the hill beyond the Plaza de España. This was the common drill ground of all the party militias, besides the carabineros and the first contingents of the newly formed popular army. Up in the public gardens it was a strange and heartening sight. Down every path and alleyway, amid the formal flower beds, squads and companies of men marched stiffly to and fro, throwing out their chests and trying desperately to look like soldiers. All of them were unarmed and none completely in uniform, though on most of them the militia uniform was breaking out in patches here and there. The procedure was always very much the same. For 3 hours we strutted to and fro. The Spanish marching step is very short and rapid. Then we halted, broke the ranks, and flocked thirstily to a little grocer's shop which was halfway down the hill and was doing a roaring trade in cheap wine. Everyone was very friendly to me. As an Englishman I was something of a curiosity, and the Carabinero officers made much of me and stood me drinks. Meanwhile, whenever I could get our lieutenant into a corner, I was clamouring to be instructed in the use of a machine gun. I used to drag my Hugo's dictionary out of my pocket and start on him in my villainous Spanish. Yo sé manejar fusil, no sé manejar ametralladora. Quiero aprender ametralladora. ¿Cuándo vamos a aprender ametralladora? The answer was always a harassed smile and a promise that there should be machine gun instruction mañana. Needless to say, mañana never came. Several days passed, and the recruits learned to march in step and spring to attention almost smartly. But if they knew which end of a rifle the bullet came out of, that was all they knew. That was all they knew. One day an armed carabinero strolled up to us when we were halting and allowed us to examine his rifle. It turned out that in the whole of my section no one except myself even knew how to load the rifle, much less how to take aim. All this time I was having the usual struggles with the Spanish language. Apart from myself, there was only one Englishman at the barracks, and nobody even among the officers spoke a word of French. Things were not made easier for me by the fact that when my companions spoke to one another, they generally spoke in Catalan. The only way I could get along was to carry everywhere a small dictionary which I whipped out of my pocket in moments of crisis. But I would sooner be a foreigner in Spain than in most countries. How easy it is to make friends in Spain. Within a day or two there was a score of militiamen who called me by my Christian name, showed me the ropes, and overwhelmed me with hospitality. I am not writing a book of propaganda, and I do not want to idealize the POUM militia. The whole militia system had serious faults, and the men themselves were a mixed lot, for by this time voluntary recruitment was falling off, and many of the best men were already at the front or dead. There was always among us a certain percentage who were completely useless. Boys of 15 were being brought up for enlistment by their parents, quite openly for the sake of the 10 pesetas a day which was the militiaman's wage. Also for the sake of the bread which the militia received in plenty and could smuggle home to their parents. But I defy anyone to be thrown as I was among the Spanish working class. I ought perhaps to say the Catalan working class, for apart from a few Aragonese and Andalusians, I mixed only with Catalans, and not be struck by their essential decency, above all their straightforwardness and generosity. A Spaniard's generosity, in the ordinary sense of the word, is at times almost embarrassing. If you ask him for a cigarette, he will force the whole packet upon you. And beyond this, there is generosity in a deeper sense, a real largeness of spirit, which I have met with again and again in the most unpromising circumstances. Some of the journalists and other foreigners who travelled in Spain during the war have declared that in secret the Spaniards were bitterly jealous of foreign aid. All I can say is that I never observed anything of the kind. I remember that a few days before I left the barracks, a group of men returned on leave from the front. They were talking excitedly about their experiences and were full of enthusiasm for some French troops who had been next to them at Huesca. The French were very brave, they said, adding enthusiastically, más valientes que nosotros, braver than we are. Of course I demurred, whereupon they explained that the French knew more of the art of war, were more expert with bombs, machine guns, and so forth. Yet the remark was significant. An Englishman would cut his hand off sooner than say a thing like that. Every foreigner who served in the militia spent his first few weeks in learning to love the Spaniards and in being exasperated by certain of their characteristics. In the front line, my own exasperation sometimes reached the pitch of fury. The Spaniards are good at many things, but not at making war. All foreigners alike are appalled by their inefficiency, above all their maddening unpunctuality. The one Spanish word that no foreigner can avoid learning is mañana, tomorrow, literally the morning. Whenever it is conceivably possible, the business of today is put off until mañana. This is so notorious that even the Spaniards themselves make jokes about it. In Spain, nothing, from a meal to a battle, ever happens at the appointed time. As a general rule, things happen too late, but just occasionally, just so that you shan't even be able to depend on their happening late, they happen too early. A train which is due to leave at 8 will normally leave at any time between 9 and 10, but perhaps once a week, thanks to some private whim of the engine driver, it leaves at 7:30. Such things can be a little trying. In theory, I rather admire the Spaniards for not sharing our northern time neurosis, but unfortunately I share it myself. After endless rumours, mañanas, and delays, we were suddenly ordered to the front at 2 hours' notice, when much of our equipment was still unissued. There were terrible tumults in the quartermaster's store. In the end, numbers of men had to leave without their full equipment. The barracks had promptly filled with women who seemed to have sprung up from the ground and were helping their menfolk to roll their blankets and pack their kit bags. It was rather humiliating that I had to be shown how to put on my new leather cartridge boxes by a Spanish girl, the wife of Williams, the other English militiaman. She was a gentle, dark-eyed, intensely feminine creature who looked as though her life work was to rock a cradle, but who as a matter of fact had fought bravely in the street battles of July. At this time she was carrying a baby which was born just 10 months after the outbreak of war and had perhaps been begotten behind a barricade. The train was due to leave at 8, and it was about 8:10 when the harassed, sweating officers managed to marshal us in the barrack square. I remember very vividly the torchlit scene, the uproar and excitement, the red flags flapping in the torchlight, the massed ranks of militiamen with their knapsacks on their backs and their rolled blankets worn bandolier-wise across the shoulder, and the shouting and the clatter of boots and tin pannikins, and then a tremendous and finally successful hissing for silence, and then some political commissar standing beneath a huge rolling red banner and making us a speech in Catalan. Finally they marched us to the station, taking the longest route, 3 or 4 miles, so as to show us to the whole town. In the Ramblas they halted us while a borrowed band played some revolutionary tune or other. Once again the conquering hero stuff, shouting and enthusiasm, red flags and red and black flags everywhere, friendly crowds thronging the pavement to have a look at us, women waving from the windows. How natural it all seemed then, how remote and improbable now. The train was packed so tight with men that there was barely room even on the floor, let alone on the seats. At the last moment, Williams's wife came rushing down the platform and gave us a bottle of wine and a foot of that bright red sausage which tastes of soap and gives you diarrhea. The train crawled out of Catalonia and onto the plateau of Aragon at the normal wartime speed of something under 20 kilometers an hour. Chapter 2. Barbastro, though a long way from the front line, looked bleak and chipped. Swarms of militiamen in shabby uniforms wandered up and down the streets, trying to keep warm. On a ruinous wall I came upon a poster dating from the previous year, and announcing that 6 handsome bulls would be killed in the arena on such and such a date. How forlorn its faded colours looked. Where were the handsome bulls and the handsome bullfighters now? It appeared that even in Barcelona there were hardly any bullfights nowadays. For some reason, all the best matadors were fascist. They sent my company by lorry to Cietamo, then westward to Alcubierre, which was just behind the line fronting Zaragoza. Cietamo had been fought over 3 times before the anarchists finally took it in October, and parts of it were smashed to pieces by shell fire, and most of the houses pockmarked by rifle bullets. We were 1,500 feet above sea level now. It was beastly cold, with dense mists that came swirling up from nowhere. Between Cietamo and Alcubierre, the lorry driver lost his way. This was one of the regular features of the war, and we were wandering for hours in the mist. It was late at night when we reached Alcubierre. Somebody shepherded us through morasses of mud into a mule stable where we dug ourselves down into the chaff and promptly fell asleep. Chaff is not bad to sleep in when it is clean, not so good as hay, but better than straw. It was only in the morning light that I discovered that the chaff was full of bread crusts, torn newspapers, bones, dead rats, and jagged milk tins. We were near the front line now, near enough to smell the characteristic smell of war. In my experience, a smell of excrement and decaying food. Alcubierre had never been shelled and was in a better state than most of the villages immediately behind the line. Yet I believe that even in peacetime you could not travel in that part of Spain without being struck by the peculiar squalid misery of the Aragonese villages. They are built like fortresses, a mass of mean little houses of mud and stone huddling round the church, and even in spring you see hardly a flower anywhere. The houses have no gardens, only backyards where ragged fowls skate over the beds of mule dung. It was vile weather, with alternate mist and rain. The narrow earth roads had been churned into a sea of mud, in places 2 feet deep, through which the lorries struggled with racing wheels, and the peasants led their clumsy carts, which were pulled by strings of mules, sometimes as many as 6 in a string, always pulling tandem. The constant come and go of troops had reduced the village to a state of unspeakable filth. It did not possess, and never had possessed, such a thing as a lavatory or a drain of any kind, and there was not a square yard anywhere where you could tread without watching your step. The church had long been used as a latrine, so had all the fields for a quarter of a mile around. I never think of my first 2 months at war without thinking of wintry stubble fields whose edges are crusted with dung. 2 days passed and no rifles were issued to us. When you had been to the Comité de Guerra and inspected the row of holes in the wall, holes made by rifle volleys, various fascists having been executed there, you had seen all the sights that Alcubierre contained. Up in the front line things were obviously quiet. Very few wounded were coming in. The chief excitement was the arrival of fascist deserters, who were brought under guard from the front line. Many of the troops opposite us on this part of the line were not fascists at all, merely wretched conscripts who had been doing their military service at the time when war broke out and were only too anxious to escape. Occasionally, small batches of them took the risk of slipping across to our lines. No doubt more would have done so if their relatives had not been in fascist territory. These deserters were the first real fascists I had ever seen. It struck me that they were indistinguishable from ourselves, except that they wore khaki overalls. They were always ravenously hungry when they arrived, natural enough after a day or 2 of dodging about in no man's land, but it was always triumphantly pointed to as a proof that the fascist troops were starving. I watched one of them being fed in a peasant's house. It was somehow rather a pitiful sight. A tall boy of 20, deeply windburnt, with his clothes in rags, crouched over the fire, shoveling a pannikin full of stew into himself at desperate speed, and all the while his eyes flitted nervously round the ring of militiamen who stood watching him. I think he still half believed that we were bloodthirsty Reds and were going to shoot him as soon as he had finished his meal. The armed man who guarded him kept stroking his shoulder and making reassuring noises. On one memorable day, 15 deserters arrived in a single batch. They were led through the village in triumph with a man riding in front of them on a white horse. I managed to take a rather blurry photograph which was stolen from me later. On our 3rd morning in Alcubierre, the rifles arrived. A sergeant with a coarse, dark yellow face was handing them out in the mule stable. I got a shock of dismay when I saw the thing they gave me. It was a German Mauser, dated 1896, more than 40 years old. It was rusty, the bolt was stiff, the wooden barrel guard was split. One glance down the muzzle showed that it was corroded and past praying-for. Most of the rifles were equally bad, some of them even worse, and no attempt was made to give the best weapons to the men who knew how to use them. The best rifle of the lot, only 10 years old, was given to a half-witted little beast of 15, known to everyone as the Maricon, Nancy boy. The sergeant gave us 5 minutes instruction, which consisted in explaining how you loaded a rifle and how you took the bolt to pieces. Many of the militiamen had never had a gun in their hands before, and very few, I imagine, knew what the sights were for. Cartridges were handed out, 50 to a man, and then the ranks were formed and we strapped our kits on our backs and set out for the front line, about 3 miles away. The Centauria, 80 men and several dogs, wound raggedly up the road. Every militia column had at least one dog attached to it as a mascot. One wretched brute that marched with us had POUM branded on it in huge letters and slunk along as though conscious that there was something wrong with its appearance. At the head of the column, beside the red flag, Georges Kopp, the stout Belgian commandant, was riding a black horse. A little way ahead, a youth from the brigand-like militia cavalry pranced to and fro, galloping up every piece of rising ground and posing himself in picturesque attitudes at the summit. The splendid horses of the Spanish cavalry had been captured in large numbers during the Revolution and handed over to the militia, who, of course, were busy riding them to death. The road wound between yellow infertile fields, untouched since last year's harvest. Ahead of us was the low Sierra that lies between Alcubierre and Zaragoza. We were getting near the front line now, near the bombs, the machine guns and the mud. In secret I was frightened. I knew the line was quiet at present, but unlike most of the men about me, I was old enough to remember the Great War, though not old enough to have fought in it. War, to me, meant roaring projectiles and skipping shards of steel. Above all, it meant mud, lice, hunger and cold. It is curious, but I dreaded the cold much more than I dreaded the enemy. The thought of it had been haunting me all the time I was in Barcelona. I had even lain awake at nights thinking of the cold in the trenches, the stand-tos in the grisly dawns, the long hours on sentry go with a frosted rifle, the icy mud that would slop over my boot tops. I admit, too, that I felt a kind of horror as I looked at the people I was marching among. You cannot possibly conceive what a rabble we looked. We straggled along with far less cohesion than a flock of sheep. Before we had gone 2 miles, the rear of the column was out of sight, and quite half of the so-called men were children, but I mean literally children, of 16 years old at the very most. Yet they were all happy and excited at the prospect of getting to the front at last. As we neared the line, the boys round the red flag in front began to utter shouts of Visca POUM, Fascistas Maricones, and so forth, shouts which were meant to be warlike and menacing, but which, from those childish throats, sounded as pathetic as the cries of kittens. It seemed dreadful that the defenders of the Republic should be this mob of ragged children carrying worn-out rifles which they did not know how to use. I remember wondering what would happen if a fascist aeroplane passed our way, whether the airman would even bother to dive down and give us a burst from his machine gun. Surely even from the air he could see that we were not real soldiers. As the road struck into the Sierra, we branched off to the right and climbed a narrow mule track that wound round the mountainside. The hills in that part of Spain are of a queer formation, horseshoe-shaped with flattish tops and very steep sides running down into immense ravines. On the higher slopes nothing grows except stunted shrubs and heath, with the white bones of the limestone sticking out everywhere. The front line here was not a continuous line of trenches, which would have been impossible in such mountainous country. It was simply a chain of fortified posts, always known as positions, perched on each hilltop. In the distance you could see our position at the crown of the horseshoe, a ragged barricade of sandbags, a red flag fluttering, the smoke of dugout fires. A little nearer, and you could smell the sickening, sweetish stink that lived in my nostrils for weeks afterwards. Into the cleft immediately behind the position all the refuse of months had been tipped, a deep festering bed of bread crusts, excrement, and rusty tins. The company we were relieving were getting their kits together. They had been 3 months in the line. Their uniforms were caked with mud, their boots falling to pieces, their faces mostly bearded. The captain commanding the position, Levinsky by name, but known to everyone as Benjamin, and by birth a Polish Jew, but speaking French as his native language, crawled out of his dugout and greeted us. He was a short youth of about 25, with stiff black hair and a pale, eager face which at this period of the war was always very dirty. A few stray bullets were cracking high overhead. The position was a semicircular enclosure about 50 yards across, with a parapet that was partly sandbags and partly lumps of limestone. There were 30 or 40 dugouts running into the ground like rat holes. Williams, myself, and Williams's Spanish brother-in-law made a swift dive for the nearest unoccupied dugout that looked habitable. Somewhere in front an occasional rifle banged, making queer rolling echoes among the stony hills. We had just dumped our kits and were crawling out of the dugout when there was another bang, and one of the children of our company rushed back from the parapet with his face pouring blood. He had fired his rifle and had somehow managed to blow out the bolt. His scalp was torn to ribbons by the splinters of the burst cartridge case. It was our first casualty, and, characteristically, self-inflicted. In the afternoon we did our first guard, and Benjamin showed us around the position. In front of the parapet there ran a system of narrow trenches hewn out of the rock, with extremely primitive loopholes made of piles of limestone. There were 12 sentries placed at various points in the trench and behind the inner parapet. In front of the trench was the barbed wire, and then the hillside slid down into a seemingly bottomless ravine. Opposite were naked hills, in places mere cliffs of rock, all grey and wintry, with no life anywhere, not even a bird. I peered cautiously through a loophole, trying to find the fascist trench. "Where are the enemy?" Benjamin waved his hand expansively. "Over there." Benjamin spoke English, terrible English. But where? According to my ideas of trench warfare, the fascists would be 50 or 100 yards away. I could see nothing. Seemingly their trenches were very well concealed. Then, with a shock of dismay, I saw where Benjamin was pointing. On the opposite hilltop, beyond the ravine, 700 meters away at the very least, the tiny outline of a parapet and a red and yellow flag, the fascist position. I was indescribably disappointed. We were nowhere near them. At that range, our rifles were completely useless. But at this moment there was a shout of excitement. 2 fascists, greyish figures in the distance, were scrambling up the naked hillside opposite. Benjamin grabbed the nearest man's rifle, took aim, and pulled the trigger. Click! A dud cartridge. I thought it a bad omen. The new sentries were no sooner in the trench than they began firing a terrific fusillade at nothing in particular. I could see the fascists, tiny as ants, dodging to and fro behind their parapet, and sometimes a black dot, which was ahead, would pause for a moment, impudently exposed. It was obviously no use firing, but presently the sentry on my left, leaving his post in the typical Spanish fashion, sidled up to me and began urging me to fire. I tried to explain that at that range and with these rifles you could not hit a man except by accident. He was only a child, and he kept motioning with his rifle towards one of the dots, grinning as eagerly as a dog that expects a pebble to be thrown. Finally, I put my sights up to 700 and let fly. The dot disappeared. I hope it went near enough to make him jump. It was the first time in my life that I had fired a gun at a human being. Now that I had seen the front, I was profoundly disgusted. They called this war, and we were hardly even in touch with the enemy. I made no attempt to keep my head below the level of the trench. A little while later, however, a bullet shot past my ear with a vicious crack and banged into the parados behind. Alas! I ducked. All my life I had sworn that I would not duck the first time a bullet passed over me, but the movement appears to be instinctive, and almost everybody does it at least once. Chapter 3. In trench warfare, 5 things are important: firewood, food, tobacco, candles, and the enemy. In winter on the Zaragoza front they were important in that order, with the enemy a bad lass. Except at night, when a surprise attack was always conceivable. Nobody bothered about the enemy. They were simply remote black insects whom one occasionally saw hopping to and fro. The real preoccupation of both armies was trying to keep warm. I ought to say in passing that all the time I was in Spain I saw very little fighting. I was on the Aragon front from January to May, and between January and late March little or nothing happened on that front, except at Teruel. In March there was heavy fighting round Huesca, but I personally played only a minor part in it. Later, in June, There was the disastrous attack on Huesca, in which several thousand men were killed in a single day, but I had been wounded and disabled before that happened. The things that one normally thinks of as the horrors of war seldom happened to me. No aeroplane ever dropped a bomb anywhere near me. I do not think a shell ever exploded within 50 yards of me, and I was only in hand-to-hand fighting once. Once is once too often, I may say. Of course, I was often under heavy machine gun fire, but usually at longish ranges. Even at Huesca you were generally safe enough if you took reasonable precautions. Up here, in the hills round Zaragoza, it was simply the mingled boredom and discomfort of stationary warfare. A life as uneventful as a city clerk's, and almost as regular. Sentry go, patrols, digging, patrols, sentry go. On every hilltop, fascist or loyalist, a knot of ragged, dirty men shivering round their flag and trying to keep warm. And all day and night the meaningless bullets wandering across the empty valleys, and only by some rare improbable chance getting home on a human body. Often I used to gaze round the wintry landscape and marvel at the futility of it all, the inconclusiveness of such a kind of war. Earlier, about October, there had been savage fighting for all these hills. Then, because the lack of men and arms, especially artillery, made any large-scale operation impossible, each army had dug itself in and settled down on the hilltops it had won. Over to our right there was a small outpost, also POUM, and on the spur to our left, at 7 o'clock of us, a PSUC position faced a taller spur with several small fascist posts dotted on its peaks. The so-called line zigzagged to and fro in a pattern that would have been quite unintelligible if every position had not flown a flag. The POUM and PSUC flags were red, those of the anarchists red and black. The fascists generally flew the monarchist flag, red, yellow, red, but occasionally they flew the flag of the Republic, red, yellow, purple. The scenery was stupendous, if you could forget that every mountain top was occupied by troops and was therefore littered with tin cans and crusted with dung. To the right of us the Sierra bent southeastwards and made way for the wide, veined valley that stretched across to Huesca. In the middle of the plain a few tiny cubes sprawled like a throw of dice. This was the town of Robres, which was in loyalist possession. Often in the mornings the valley was hidden under seas of cloud, out of which the hills rose flat and blue, giving the landscape a strange resemblance to a photographic negative. Beyond Huesca there were more hills of the same formation as our own, streaked with a pattern of snow which altered day by day. In the far distance the monstrous peaks of the Pyrenees, where the snow never melts, seemed to float upon nothing. Even down the plain everything looked dead and bare. The hills opposite us were grey and wrinkled like the skins of elephants. Almost always the sky was empty of birds. I do not think I have ever seen a country where there were so few birds. The only birds one saw at any time were a kind of magpie, and the coveys of partridges that startled one at night with their sudden whirring, and, very rarely, the flights of eagles that drifted slowly over, generally followed by rifle shots which they did not deign to notice. At night and in misty weather, patrols were sent out into the valley between ourselves and the fascists. The job was not popular, it was too cold and too easy to get lost, and I soon found that I could get leave to go out on patrol as often as I wished. In the huge jagged ravines there were no paths or tracks of any kind. You could only find your way about by making successive journeys and noting fresh landmarks each time. As the bullet flies, the nearest fascist post was 700 meters from our own, but it was a mile and a half by the only practicable route. It was rather fun wandering about the dark valleys with stray bullets flying high overhead like red shanks whistling. Better than night time with a heavy mist, which often lasted all day and which had a habit of clinging round the hilltops and leaving the valleys clear. When you were anywhere near the fascist lines, you had to creep at a snail's pace. It was very difficult to move quietly on those hillsides, among the crackling shrubs and tinkling limestones. It was only at the third or fourth attempt that I managed to find my way to the fascist lines. The mist was very thick, and I crept up to the barbed wire to listen. I could hear the fascists talking and singing inside. Then, to my alarm, I heard several of them coming down the hill towards me. I cowered behind a bush that suddenly seemed very small and tried to cock my rifle without noise. However, they branched off and did not come within sight of me. Behind the bush where I was hiding, I came upon various relics of the earlier fighting, a pile of empty cartridge cases, a leather cap with a bullet hole in it, and a red flag, obviously one of our own. I took it back to the position where it was unsentimentally torn up for cleaning rags. I had been made a corporal, or cabo as it was called, as soon as we reached the front, and was in command of a guard of 12 men. It was no sinecure, especially at first. The Centuria was an untrained mob composed mostly of boys in their teens. Here and there in the militia you came across children as young as 11 or 12, usually refugees from fascist territory who had been enlisted as militiamen as the easiest way of providing for them. As a rule, they were employed on light work in the rear, but sometimes they managed to worm their way to the front line, where they were a public menace. I remember one little brute throwing a hand grenade into the dugout fire for a joke. At Monte Pasero, I do not think there was anyone younger than 15, but the average age must have been well under 20. Boys of this age ought never to be used in the front line, because they cannot stand the lack of sleep which is inseparable from trench warfare. At the beginning, it was almost impossible to keep our position properly guarded at night. The wretched children of my section could only be roused by dragging them out of their dugouts feet foremost, and as soon as your back was turned they left their posts and slipped into shelter, or they would even, in spite of the frightful cold, lean up against the wall of the trench and fall fast asleep. Luckily the enemy were very unenterprising. There were nights when it seemed to me that our position could be stormed by 20 Boy Scouts armed with air guns, or 20 Girl Guides armed with battledores, for that matter. At this time, and until much later, the Catalan militias were still on the same basis as they had been at the beginning of the war. In the early days of Franco's revolt, the militias had been hurriedly raised by the various trade unions and political parties. Each was essentially a political organization, owing allegiance to its party as much as to the central government. When the Popular Army, which was a non-political army organized on more or less ordinary lines, was raised at the beginning of 1937, the party militias were theoretically incorporated in it. But for a long time the only changes that occurred were on paper. The new Popular Army troops did not reach the Aragon front in any numbers till June, and until that time the militia system remained unchanged. The essential point of the system was social equality between officers and men. Everyone from general to private drew the same pay, ate the same food, wore the same clothes, and mingled on terms of complete equality. If you wanted to slap the general commanding the division on the back and ask him for a cigarette, you could do so, and no one thought it curious. In theory, at any rate, each militia was a democracy and not a hierarchy. It was understood that orders had to be obeyed, but it was also understood that when you gave an order, you gave it as comrade to comrade, and not as superior to inferior. There were officers and NCOs, but there was no military rank in the ordinary sense. No titles, no badges, no heel-clicking and saluting. They had attempted to produce within the militias a sort of temporary working model of the classless society. Of course, there was not perfect equality, but there was a nearer approach to it than I had ever seen or than I would have thought conceivable in time of war. But I admit that at first sight the state of affairs at the front horrified me. How on earth could the war be won by an army of this type? It was what everyone was saying at the time, and though it was true, it was also unreasonable. For in the circumstances, the militias could not have been much better than they were. A modern mechanized army does not spring up out of the ground, and if the government had waited until it had trained troops at its disposal, Franco would never have been resisted. Later it became the fashion to decry the militias, and therefore to pretend that the faults which were due to lack of training and weapons were the result of the equalitarian system. Actually, a newly raised draft of militia was an undisciplined mob, not because the officers called the privates comrade, but because raw troops are always an undisciplined mob. In practice, the democratic revolutionary type of discipline is more reliable than might be expected. In a workers' army, discipline is theoretically voluntary. It is based on class loyalty, whereas the discipline of a bourgeois conscript army is based ultimately on fear. The popular army that replaced the militias was midway between the two types. In the militias, the bullying and abuse that go on in an ordinary army would never have been tolerated for a moment. The normal military punishments existed, but they were only invoked for very serious offences. When a man refused to obey an order, you did not immediately get him punished. You first appealed to him in the name of comradeship. Cynical people with no experience of handling men will say instantly that this would never work. But as a matter of fact, it does work in the long run. The discipline of even the worst drafts of militia visibly improved as time went on. In January, the job of keeping a dozen raw recruits up to the mark almost turned my hair grey. In May, for a short while, I was acting lieutenant in command of about 30 men, English and Spanish. We had all been under fire for months, and I never had the slightest difficulty in getting an order obeyed or in getting men to volunteer for a dangerous job. Revolutionary discipline depends on political consciousness, on an understanding of why orders must be obeyed. It takes time to diffuse this, but it also takes time to drill a man into an automaton on the barrack square. The journalists who sneered at the militia system seldom remembered that the militias had to hold the line while the popular army was training in the rear, and it is a tribute to the strength of revolutionary discipline that the militias stayed in the field at all. For until about June 1937 there was nothing to keep them there, except class loyalty. Individual deserters could be shot, were shot occasionally, but if 1,000 men had decided to walk out of the line together, there was no force to stop them. A conscript army in the same circumstances, with its battle police removed, would have melted away. Yet the militias held the line, though God knows they won very few victories, and even individual desertions were not common. In 4 or 5 months in the POUM militia, I only heard of 4 men deserting, and 2 of those were fairly certainly spies who had enlisted to obtain information. At the beginning, the apparent chaos, the general lack of training, the fact that you often had to argue for 5 minutes before you could get an order obeyed, appalled and infuriated me. I had British Army ideas, and certainly the Spanish militias were very unlike the British Army. But considering the circumstances, they were better troops than one had any right to expect. Meanwhile, firewood, always firewood. Throughout that period, there is probably no entry in my diary that does not mention firewood, or rather the lack of it. We were between 2,000 and 3,000 feet above sea level. It was midwinter and the cold was unspeakable. The temperature was not exceptionally low, and many nights it did not even freeze, and the wintry sun often shone for an hour in the middle of the day. But even if it was not really cold, I assure you that it seemed so. Sometimes there were shrieking winds that tore your cap off and twisted your hair in all directions. Sometimes there were mists that poured into the trench like a liquid and seemed to penetrate your bones. Frequently it rained, and even a quarter of an hour's rain was enough to make conditions intolerable. The thin skin of earth over the limestone turned promptly into a slippery grease, and as you were always walking on a slope, it was impossible to keep your footing. On dark nights I have often fallen 6 times in 20 yards, and this was dangerous, because it meant that the lock of one's rifle became jammed with mud. For days together, clothes, boots, blankets, and rifles were more or less coated with mud. I had brought as many thick clothes as I could carry, but many of the men were terribly underclad. For the whole garrison, about 100 men, there were only 12 greatcoats, which had to be handed from sentry to sentry, and most of the men had only 1 blanket. One icy night, I made a list in my diary of the clothes I was wearing. It is of some interest, as showing the amount of clothes the human body can carry. I was wearing a thick vest and pants, a flannel shirt, 2 pullovers, a woolen jacket, a pigskin jacket, corduroy breeches, puttees, thick socks, boots, a stout trench coat, a muffler, lined leather gloves, and a woolen cap. Nevertheless, I was shivering like a jelly, but I admit I am unusually sensitive to cold. Firewood was the one thing that really mattered. The point about the firewood was that there was practically no firewood to be had. Our miserable mountain had not even at its best much vegetation, and for months it had been ranged over by freezing militiamen, with the result that everything thicker than one's finger had long since been burnt. When we were not eating, sleeping, on guard, or on fatigue duty, we were in the valley behind the position, scrounging for fuel. All my memories of that time are memories of scrambling up and down the almost perpendicular slopes, over the jagged limestone that knocked one's boots to pieces, pouncing eagerly on tiny twigs of wood. 3 people searching for a couple of hours could collect enough fuel to keep the dugout fire alight for about an hour. The eagerness of our search for firewood turned us all into botanists. We classified, according to their burning qualities, every plant that grew on the mountainside, the various heaths and grasses that were good to start a fire with but burnt out in a few minutes, the wild rosemary and the tiny wind bushes that would burn when the fire was well alight, the stunted oak tree, smaller than a gooseberry bush, that was practically unburnable. There was a kind of dried-up reed that was very good for starting fires with, but these grew only on the hilltop to the left of the position, and you had to go under fire to get them. If the fascist machine gunners saw you, they gave you a drum of ammunition all to yourself. Generally, their aim was high and the bullets sang overhead like birds, but sometimes they crackled and chipped the limestone uncomfortably close, whereupon you flung yourself on your face. You went on gathering reeds, however. Nothing mattered in comparison with firewood. Beside the cold, the other discomforts seemed petty. Of course, all of us were permanently dirty. Our water, like our food, came on muleback from Alcubierre, and each man's share worked out at about a quart a day. It was beastly water, hardly more transparent than milk. Theoretically it was for drinking only, but I always stole a pannikinful for washing in the mornings. I used to wash one day and shave the next. There was never enough water for both. The position stank abominably, and outside the little enclosure of the barricade there was excrement everywhere. Some of the militiamen habitually defecated in the trench, a disgusting thing when one had to walk round in it in the darkness. But the dirt never worried me. Dirt is a thing people make too much fuss about. It is astonishing how quickly you get used to doing without a handkerchief and to eating out of the tin pannikin in which you also wash. Nor was sleeping in one's clothes any hardship after a day or 2. It was of course impossible to take one's clothes and especially one's boots off at night. One had to be ready to turn out instantly in case of an attack. In 80 nights I only took my clothes off 3 times, though I did occasionally manage to get them off in the daytime. It was too cold for lice as yet, but rats and mice abounded. It is often said that you don't find rats and mice in the same place, but you do when there is enough food for them. In other ways we were not badly off. The food was good enough, and there was plenty of wine. Cigarettes were still being issued at the rate of a packet a day, matches were issued every other day, and there was even an issue of candles. They were very thin candles, like those on a Christmas cake, and were popularly supposed to have been looted from churches. Every dugout was issued daily with 3 inches of candle, which would burn for about 20 minutes. At that time it was still possible to buy candles, and I had brought several pounds of them with me. Later on, the famine of matches and candles made life a misery. You do not realize the importance of these things until you lack them. In a night alarm, for instance, when everyone in the dugout is scrambling for his rifle and treading on everybody else's face, being able to strike a light may make the difference between life and death. Every militiaman possessed a tinder lighter and several yards of yellow wick. Next to his rifle, it was his most important possession. The tinder lighters had the great advantage that they could be struck in a wind, but they would only smoulder, so that they were no use for lighting a fire. When the match famine was at its worst, our only way of producing a flame was to pull the bullet out of a cartridge and touch the cordite off with a tinder lighter. It was an extraordinary life that we were living, an extraordinary way to be at war, if you could call it war. The whole militia chafed against the inaction and clamoured constantly to know why we were not allowed to attack. But it was perfectly obvious that there would be no battle for a long while yet, unless the enemy started it. Georges Kopp, on his periodical tours of inspection, was quite frank with us. "This is not a war," he used to say. "It's a comic opera with an occasional death." As a matter of fact, the stagnation on the Aragon front had political causes of which I knew nothing at that time, but the purely military difficulties, quite apart from the lack of reserves of men, were obvious to anybody. To begin with, there was the nature of the country. The front line, ours and the fascists, lay in positions of immense natural strength, which as a rule could only be approached from one side. Provided a few trenches have been dug, such places cannot be taken by infantry, except in overwhelming numbers. In our position, or most of those around us, a dozen men with 2 machine guns could have held off a battalion. Perched on the hilltops as we were, we should have made lovely marks for artillery, but there was no artillery. Sometimes I used to gaze round the landscape and long, oh, how passionately, for a couple of batteries of guns. One could have destroyed the enemy positions one after another as easily as smashing nuts with a hammer, but on our side the guns simply did not exist. The fascists did occasionally manage to bring a gun or 2 from Zaragoza and fire a very few shells, so few that they never even found the range and the shells plunged harmlessly into the empty ravines. Against machine guns and without artillery there are only 3 things you can do. Dig yourself in at a safe distance, 400 yards, say, advance across the open and be massacred, or make small-scale night attacks that will not alter the general situation. Practically the alternatives are stagnation or suicide. And beyond this, there was the complete lack of war materials of every description. It needs an effort to realize how badly the militias were armed at this time. Any public school OTC in England is far more like a modern army than we were. The badness of our weapons was so astonishing that it is worth recording in detail. For this sector of the front, the entire artillery consisted of 4 trench mortars with 15 rounds for each gun. Of course, they were far too precious to be fired, and the mortars were kept in Alcubierre. There were machine guns at the rate of approximately 1 to 50 men. They were oldish guns, but fairly accurate up to 300 or 400 yards. Beyond this, we had only rifles, and the majority of the rifles were scrap iron. There were 3 types of rifle in use. The first was the long Mauser. These were seldom less than 20 years old. Their sights were about as much use as a broken speedometer, and in most of them the rifling was hopelessly corroded. About 1 rifle in 10 was not bad, however. Then there was the short Mauser, or mousqueton, really a cavalry weapon. These were more popular than the others because they were lighter to carry and less nuisance in a trench, also because they were comparatively new and looked efficient. Actually, they were almost useless. They were made out of reassembled parts. No bolt belonged to its rifle, and 3/4 of them could be counted on to jam after 5 shots. There were also a few Winchester rifles. These were nice to shoot with, but they were wildly inaccurate, and as the cartridges had no clips, they could only be fired 1 shot at a time. Ammunition was so scarce that each man entering the line was only issued with 50 rounds, and most of it was exceedingly bad. The Spanish-made cartridges were all refills and would jam even the best rifles. The Mexican cartridges were better and were therefore reserved for the machine guns. Best of all was the German-made ammunition, but as this came only from prisoners and deserters, there was not much of it. I always kept a clip of German or Mexican ammunition in my pocket for use in emergency, but in practice, when the emergency came, I seldom fired my rifle. I was too frightened of the beastly thing jamming and too anxious to reserve at any rate 1 round that would go off. We had no tin hats, no bayonets, hardly any revolvers or pistols, and not more than 1 bomb between 5 or 10 men. The bomb in use at this time was a frightful object known as the FAI bomb, it having been produced by the anarchists in the early days of the war. It was on the principle of a Mills bomb, but the lever was held down not by a pin, but a piece of tape. You broke the tape and then got rid of the bomb with the utmost possible speed. It was said of these bombs that they were impartial. They killed the man they were thrown at and the man who threw them. There were several other types, even more primitive but probably a little less dangerous, to the thrower, I mean. It was not till late March that I saw a bomb worth throwing, and apart from weapons there was a shortage of all the minor necessities of war. We had no maps or charts, for instance. Spain has never been fully surveyed, and the only detailed maps of this area were the old military ones, which were almost all in the possession of the fascists. We had no rangefinders, no telescopes, no periscopes, no field glasses except a few privately owned pairs, no flares or very lights, no wire cutters, no armourers' tools. hardly even any cleaning materials. The Spaniards seemed never to have heard of a pull-through, and looked on in surprise when I constructed one. When you wanted your rifle cleaned, you took it to the sergeant, who possessed a long brass ramrod which was invariably bent and therefore scratched the rifling. There was not even any gun oil. You greased your rifle with olive oil when you could get hold of it. At different times I had greased mine with Vaseline, with cold cream, and even with bacon fat. Moreover, there were no lanterns or electric torches. At this time there was not, I believe, such a thing as an electric torch throughout the whole of our sector of the front, and you could not buy one nearer than Barcelona, and only with difficulty even there. As time went on, and the desultory rifle fire rattled among the hills, I began to wonder with increasing scepticism whether anything would ever happen to bring a bit of life, or rather a bit of death, into this cockeyed war. It was pneumonia that we were fighting against, not against men. When the trenches are more than 500 yards apart, no one gets hit except by accident. Of course, there were casualties, but the majority of them were self-inflicted. If I remember rightly, the first 5 men I saw wounded in Spain were all wounded by our own weapons. I don't mean intentionally, but owing to accident or carelessness. Our worn-out rifles were a danger in themselves. Some of them had a nasty trick of going off if the butt was tapped on the ground. I saw a man shoot himself through the hand owing to this, and in the darkness the raw recruits were always firing at one another. One evening, when it was barely even dusk, a sentry let fly at me from a distance of 20 yards, but he missed me by a yard. Goodness knows how many times the Spanish standard of a marksmanship has saved my life. Another time I had gone out on patrol in the mist and had carefully warned the guard commander beforehand. But in coming back I stumbled against a bush. The startled sentry called out that the fascists were coming, and I had the pleasure of hearing the guard commander order everyone to open rapid fire in my direction. Of course I lay down and the bullets went harmlessly over me. Nothing will convince a Spaniard, at least a young Spaniard, that firearms are dangerous. Once, rather later than this, I was photographing some machine gunners with their gun, which was pointed directly towards me. "Don't fire," I said half-jokingly as I focused the camera. "Oh no, we won't fire." The next moment there was a frightful roar and a stream of bullets tore past my face so close that my cheek was stung by grains of cordite. It was unintentional, but the machine gunners considered it a great joke. Yet only a few days earlier they had seen a mule driver accidentally shot by a political delegate who was playing the fool with an automatic pistol and had put 5 bullets in the mule driver's lungs. The difficult passwords which the army was using at this time were a minor source of danger. They were those tiresome double passwords in which one word has to be answered by another. Usually they were of an elevating and revolutionary nature, such as Cultura Progresso or Seramos Invencibles, and it was often impossible to get illiterate sentries to remember these highfalutin words. One night, I remember, the password was Catalonia Heroica, and a moon-faced peasant lad named Jaime Dominic approached me, greatly puzzled, and asked me to explain. Heroica? What does heroica mean? I told him that it meant the same as valiente. A little while later he was stumbling up the trench in the darkness, and the sentry challenged him. "Alto! Catalunya!" "Valiente!" yelled Jaime, certain that he was saying the right thing. Bang! However, the sentry missed him. In this war everyone always did miss everyone else, when it was humanly possible.